Imagine being born into unimaginable wealth, power, and privilege, only to use it to belittle your staff, insult your subjects, and make even other royals cringe. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a highlight reel of monarchy at its most unfiltered. From savage snubs to cold-blooded arrogance, these aren't just rulers. They're regal-grade jerks. Welcome to the crown's darker side. These are the 30 biggest douchebags in British royal history, ranked not by birthright, but by how spectacularly they made everyone around them miserable. Before we dive headfirst into royal arrogance, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next deep dive into history's most questionable characters. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it over there? We want to know who else is wide awake at 3 a.m. questioning the moral integrity of monarchs. Let's begin. 1. King George IV. Some people are born into greatness. Others are born into tailors, debt collectors, and scandal, then stumble into a throne. George IV, formerly the Prince Regent, was less a monarch and more a walking cautionary tale about unchecked ego, velvet waistcoats, and gout. To say he was disliked is generous. His father, George III, thought he was useless. His wife, Caroline of Brunswick, called him a monster. The British public? They called him the fat Adonis. Not out of affection. He was vain to the point of parody, obsessed with his appearance despite ballooning into caricature, plastered in rouge, stuffed into corsets, and oozing arrogance. His only real exercise was escaping responsibility. He once banned his own wife from his coronation, staged parades just to wave at people who hated him, and demanded constant praise while the country sank into economic turmoil. Servants described his tantrums as royal theater, dramatic, cruel, and always followed by another expensive indulgence. He treated people like wallpaper, decorative, ignorable, and ultimately replaceable. He had no real friends, just decorators, debtors, and the lingering smell of brandy. And yet somehow he made Henry VIII look subtle by comparison. Because next up is a man who didn't just act like he was the center of the universe. He had a bad habit of executing anyone who suggested otherwise. 2. King Henry VIII. If you were alive during the reign of Henry VIII, your head had a non-zero chance of being removed simply because the king didn't like your tone. Yes, the jokes are easy. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, 1 survived. But behind the historical memes and musical adaptations is something darker. Henry VIII was not a charming rogue. He was a man who operated like a paranoid CEO with unchecked power and zero HR oversight. His friendships were conditional, his moods volcanic. His court, a revolving door of sycophants and future corpses. He didn't just betray friends. He studied them first, learned their weaknesses, then turned them into cautionary tales. Thomas More? Executed. Thomas Cromwell? Same. Anne Boleyn? She gave him a daughter and lost her head. In public, he smiled. In private, he brooded, shouted, and orchestrated smear campaigns centuries before tabloids were invented. By mid-reign, he had ballooned physically and emotionally. Furious when he wasn't adored, devastated when he was disobeyed, and wildly insecure about everything from heirs to gout. His courtiers learned to nod, flatter, and never, ever bring bad news. His rule wasn't just a reign of terror. It was a mood swing with a crown. And if you thought Henry was bad, imagine being raised under the weight of that shadow, and still somehow making everyone around you fear your moods more. 2 royals down, 28 to go, and somehow the egos are only getting bigger. If you're still with us, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next scandalous entry. And while we unravel more royal disasters, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Are you multitasking at work or doom scrolling through history at 2 a.m. like the rest of us? 3. Queen Victoria, in private. The statues make her look serene. The history books call her dignified. But if you ever worked in Queen Victoria's household, especially during one of her famous sulks, you'd probably describe her more like an emotional glacier with an impeccable handwriting style and a penchant for psychological warfare. Publicly, she was the grandmother of Europe. Privately, she was a thundercloud in widow's black, known for her punishing silences and sudden eruptions of icy disdain. Her letters to staff and family reveal a woman who weaponized disappointment with surgical precision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. A well-placed sigh from Victoria could send a maid spiraling into weeks of existential dread. After Prince Albert died, she retreated emotionally and never fully returned. Servants walked on eggshells. Ministers dreaded her moods. Her children called her controlling and harsh, especially behind closed doors. The closer you were to her, the colder it could get. And her private journals? Full of devastating jabs, condescending remarks, and more than a few cutting lines about people who thought they were her equals. History loves to remember her as the embodiment of order and propriety. But in the back halls of Buckingham, she was more like a thunderstorm trapped in a teacup. And if you thought Victoria was chilling in her disappointment, wait until you meet the man who preferred to say it all, to your face with a smirk, in the most offensive way possible. 4. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. If Queen Victoria punished with silence, Prince Philip punished with punchlines. Sharp, fast, and frequently ill-advised, the Duke of Edinburgh mastered the ancient art of saying the exact wrong thing at exactly the wrong time, and making it sound like a compliment. He wasn't evil. He wasn't cruel in the classical sense, but tact was never his native language. Whether addressing world leaders or teenage interns, he had a gift for turning small talk into landmines. "Where did you get that hat?" could somehow sound like a threat. He once told a British student in China that if they stayed too long, they'd go home with slitty eyes. That was the first 5 minutes of the conversation. His defenders called him refreshingly blunt. His critics called him a snob with a microphone. But everyone agreed. He said what no one else dared to, and often what no one needed to hear. Servants reported him as impatient and snappy. Diplomats tiptoed around his one-liners like active grenades. Even the Queen seemed to brace herself occasionally. And yet, there was a kind of consistency to him. He offended everyone equally. Race, rank, religion. It was all fair game to the royal roastmaster. Still, sharp words are one thing. Public humiliation is another. And the next royal in line wielded sarcasm like a weaponized crown jewel. 5. Queen Elizabeth I. Glorious, iconic, fierce, and also, by most contemporary accounts, absolutely terrifying to work for. Queen Elizabeth I was a political genius with a flair for oratory, fashion, and metaphorical daggers. But if you were a courtier hoping for a smile or a casual "well done," you were more likely to get an eviscerating lecture about your choice of collar. She was sharp-tongued, theatrically irritable, and very, very aware of her own power. If a man displeased her, she might humiliate him publicly, mock his poetry, or remind him, sweetly, that she had the authority to destroy his entire bloodline. Privately, she was insecure. Publicly, she was a performance. But underneath the wigs and pageantry was a woman who had trained herself to be emotionally bulletproof and, as a consequence, occasionally inhuman. She once told an ambassador he spoke like a beast, and when a courtier requested permission to marry without her blessing, she unleashed such a torrent of rage that he fled the palace and hid. Her vanity was legendary. So was her suspicion. She had no close female friends, few trusted men, and a rotating door of suitors she discarded like wigs gone out of style. She ruled with brilliance, and with ice. And if you think that sounds harsh, just wait until you meet the king who thought belching, heckling, and chain-smoking through Parliament counted as statesmanship. 6. King James I of Scotland. King James I, also known as James of Scotland, was a man of contradictions, scholarly but crude, clever but socially abrasive, devoutly religious but disturbingly fond of being offensive at dinner. If Elizabeth was a razor wrapped in silk, James was a sock full of pennies hurled across the room. He lacked tact, grace, and, according to many ambassadors, basic human decency. His idea of diplomacy involved mocking people to their faces and cackling when they didn't know whether it was a joke. He chewed tobacco constantly, coughed like a cartoon villain, and once described a foreign visitor as a stinking papist with the manners of a goat. This was during a banquet. His court was chaotic. His favorites, often referred to with whispers and knowing glances, wielded strange influence. James's opinions fluctuated wildly, depending on who last made him laugh. He loved long-winded theological arguments, hated being corrected, and once responded to political criticism with a fart joke. Servants found him unpredictable. Nobles found him exhausting. Foreign envoys reported back that England's new king was brilliant, yes, but also gross, erratic, and barely housebroken. And yet somehow, even he had moments of charm. The next king, however, had no time for charm, just a deeply rooted belief in his divine right to ignore everyone around him. 7. King Charles I. King Charles. I didn't scream, didn't swear, didn't storm down palace corridors flipping banquet tables. He didn't need to. His version of being a jerk was far more refined, an artful blend of passive contempt, divine entitlement, and the sort of cold detachment usually reserved for marble statues and malfunctioning customer service robots. He believed, quite literally, that he was appointed by God to rule. Not just in the poetic ceremonial sense, no, actually chosen by the Almighty, which made disagreeing with him not just inconvenient, but borderline blasphemous. Parliament? Optional. Advice? Insulting. He once sat through a session of government with the expression of a man forced to endure a tedious opera performed by his least favorite relatives. Courtiers described him as haughty, unapproachable, and utterly indifferent to the reality around him. Nobles who had served under his father found themselves demoted or dismissed because they failed to match Charles's standards of sycophancy. He gave off the distinct impression that he tolerated the rest of the world only because he hadn't yet figured out how to rule without it. Even when civil war broke out, largely because of his refusal to listen to anyone, he stayed convinced that everyone else was wrong. He wasn't a tyrant in the Henry VIII mold. He was just profoundly uninterested in being wrong. Which brings us to a royal who didn't wait for a crown to start acting like one. He was just a prince. But the arrogance? Full regalia. 8. King Edward VII, as Prince of Wales. Before he became king, Edward VII was known as Bertie, which sounds sweet until you realize Bertie treated most people like furniture with opinions he didn't ask for. As Prince of Wales, he spent decades not ruling and instead perfecting his real skills, snubbing commoners, embarrassing his mother, and burning through his allowance faster than Parliament could approve the budget. He was dismissive, lazy, and easily bored by anything that didn't involve horses, mistresses, or being complimented. Servants described his attitude as imperial without the empire. He hated paperwork, skipped briefings, and considered most official functions beneath him, unless there was a lavish buffet. Or better yet, no speeches. Queen Victoria, his mother, openly despaired over his lack of discipline. She referred to him as a disappointment with the exasperation of someone who knew she couldn't return the gift. Foreign diplomats learned quickly to keep conversations light and flattering. Anything else? He'd drift off, smirk, or say something snide. He wasn't dangerous. He was just insufferable. A man who could suck the dignity out of a room just by entering it with the wrong facial expression. He carried himself like a king long before the crown landed on his head, and somehow managed to make even luxury look petty. But if you think spoiled princes are bad, wait until we get to a princess who wielded rudeness like a sport, one cruel remark at a time. 9. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. If elegance could roll its eyes, smoke a cigarette, and dismiss your entire existence with one glance. It would look a lot like Princess Margaret. The younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, Margaret had beauty, status, and a platinum-plated sense of superiority. She was a royal, yes, but one who acted like her birthright included the right to be rude. Stories of her public snubs, icy stares, and perfectly timed humiliations float around like ghost sightings at royal banquets. One dinner guest recalled being seated next to her and receiving exactly 2 words over 3 courses. Don't talk. Actors, staff, journalists, fellow aristocrats, none were spared. She had the kind of arrogance that wasn't loud or explosive, just simmering and constant, like expensive perfume mixed with contempt. And woe unto anyone who tried to be familiar. Margaret did not do relatable. She once allegedly told a man at a party, "If you have to ask who I am, I'm not going to tell you." But perhaps her greatest gift was in making people feel beneath her while smiling, as if granting them the favor of her disdain. She could walk into a room and lower the temperature 10 degrees with a single look. Still, if Margaret was high society mean, the next royal was medieval mean, the kind who didn't care if you liked him, feared him, or cursed his name for generations. 10. King John. To be hated in the Middle Ages, you really had to try. And King John? He put in the work. Even in a brutal era where monarchs casually sentenced people to dungeons and declared wars before breakfast, John stood out for being uniquely unpleasant. Chronicles of his reign read like a list of grievances filed by an entire continent. He was petty, paranoid, and vindictive. His nobles despised him. His family barely tolerated him. Even his own mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who raised lions, thought he was a bit much. Contemporary writers described him as moody and vicious, prone to lashing out for no reason, and fond of squeezing every last coin from his subjects without offering so much as a thank you or a stable government in return. When nobles protested his erratic behavior, he didn't try diplomacy. He tried revenge. The Magna Carta? That wasn't a noble moment in democratic evolution. That was his barons cornering him into signing a royal cease and desist because his jerk levels had reached national emergency. And once he signed it, he immediately tried to break every clause. Classic John. He wasn't just a bad king. He was a personally unpleasant one, a man whose absence was mourned only because it meant fewer taxes and fewer tantrums. But if you think John was arrogant, wait until you meet his older brother, the famous crusader who loved war, glory, and almost no one else. 11. King Richard III, the Lionheart. If medieval PR had an MVP, it was Richard the Lionheart. He's been immortalized in statues, legends, and Hollywood scripts as the ideal chivalric king. Brave, noble, righteous. But once you step out of the myth and into the actual history, what you get is a man who was less noble crusader and more emotionally distant war tourist with a superiority complex. He spent barely any time in England, about 6 months total over a 10-year reign. The rest? Fighting wars, draining the treasury, and treating his kingdom like a bank account with inconvenient peasants attached. He didn't speak English. He didn't particularly like the English. In fact, he once called his kingdom cold and always raining, which, fair but still not ideal monarch behavior. To his fellow nobles, he was arrogant, dismissive, and reckless. Diplomats found him impatient and overbearing. And his own army? They respected his bravery but learned quickly that Richard cared more about glory than people. He'd risk hundreds of lives just to pull off a dramatic maneuver or win a personal grudge match on the battlefield. He wasn't cruel in the everyday petty sense. He was just distant, obsessed with conquest, and thoroughly uninterested in the idea of being a king to his actual subjects. And yet somehow the next monarch managed to take Richard's arrogance, remove the charm, and add a flair for public tantrums that could shake the rafters. 12. King William II, Rufus. If King William II, known as Rufus for his red hair and even redder temper, were around today, he'd be the guy heckling at a wedding, storming out of boardrooms and bragging about it on the way down the hall. His court was famous, not for elegance, not for art, but for chaos, crude jokes, and humiliation as a spectator sport. He ruled like a man constantly trying to one-up a ghost, namely his father, William the Conqueror. But where the conqueror was calculating and commanding, Rufus was brash and insecure, lashing out with the kind of childish cruelty that made servants flinch and nobles whisper behind closed doors. He delighted in tearing people down, verbally, theatrically, and in public. Court records describe sudden outbursts, screaming fits over minor inconveniences, and an almost gleeful pleasure in mocking clergy, advisors, and guests. Morality? That was for monks. William surrounded himself with flatterers and sycophants, and even they found him exhausting. He demanded loyalty, but gave no affection. He punished disobedience like a bored tyrant looking for an excuse. And when his infamous temper flared, the safest place to be was nowhere near him. His mysterious death in a hunting accident only added to the legacy. Few mourned. Many suspected. Almost no one missed him. And as for the next royal? Think fewer outbursts, more cold fury, and a towering presence that made even his allies afraid to make eye contact. 13. King Edward I. Longshanks. King Edward I wasn't loud. He didn't have to be. His mere presence could make courtiers fumble their words and seasoned nobles rethink their life choices. Towering in stature and infamously stern, Longshanks ruled with the intensity of a man who saw compromise as a personal insult and mercy as a strategic failure. This was a king who expected obedience, not admiration, not affection, just raw, absolute compliance. His court was said to be a place of constant tension, where even minor missteps could result in public humiliation or permanent exile. He barked orders with military precision, demanded punctuality down to the second, and reportedly once reduced a nobleman to tears over a poorly chosen fabric for a ceremonial robe. He didn't rage like his predecessors. He radiated controlled fury. Even his children found him terrifying. His daughter-in-law once described him as impossible to please and like stone when angered. He treated advisors like chess pieces, useful until they made a wrong move. His famous legal reforms? Groundbreaking. But behind them was a man who enforced law with an iron fist and viewed dissent as disloyalty. He was feared, respected, and almost entirely unloved. And yet the next king on our list wasn't quite so statuesque or terrifying. He was quicker, more emotional, and could dismantle a man with a cutting joke before breakfast. 14. King Henry II. If King Edward I was all granite and intimidation, Henry II was Mercury, sharp, volatile, impossible to hold, and prone to sudden eruptions that could scorch everyone within shouting distance. A brilliant administrator, sure, but also deeply sarcastic, moody, and known for tearing into his courtiers with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely enjoyed watching people squirm. His outbursts were legendary, his sulks were longer than most treaties, and his insults? Witty, personal, and delivered with the flair of someone who kept a mental Rolodex of everyone's weaknesses. He surrounded himself with talented people, and then systematically alienated nearly all of them. Thomas Becket, his closest friend turned archbishop, learned this the hard way. Their relationship began as a partnership and ended in a disaster still taught in history classes, mostly because Henry couldn't stop himself from treating allies like chess pawns and enemies like future projects. Even his family suffered. His sons rebelled against him multiple times. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, eventually led an uprising. This wasn't a coincidence. It was exhaustion. Henry's mix of brilliance and emotional whiplash could grind down anyone. His charm came in waves. His temper? Always ready to boil. And speaking of queens who didn't handle betrayal well, up next is one whose frigid wrath could end a career, a friendship, or a dynasty, all before tea. 15. Queen Anne. Queen Anne was not the screaming type. She didn't throw goblets or slap courtiers in full view of a stunned banquet hall. No, her specialty was slow, suffocating rejection, the kind that starts with a glance, turns into an awkward silence, and ends with you exiled to a drafty estate and replaced by someone prettier, younger, or simply more obedient. She was chronically ill, emotionally raw, and surrounded by shifting alliances that felt less like friendships and more like psychological warfare in corsets. Her court was a tense waltz of passive aggression. Once you lost Anne's trust, or worse, her affection, you were finished. She wouldn't scream. She would withdraw, coldly, thoroughly, and without a hint of regret. Ask Sarah Churchill, her once dearest confidant turned political pariah. Their decades-long friendship ended not with betrayal, but with Anne's increasingly icy detachment and refusal to so much as look her in the eye. To be close to Anne was to walk a tightrope of mood swings and insecurity, never knowing when the affection would turn brittle or when a forgotten curtsy might snowball into exile. Her letters were stiff, her small talk excruciating, and her emotional walls ironclad. And once the door closed on you, it stayed closed. And yet even Anne's frosty temperament pales next to the royal who followed, a king who barely tried to hide his disdain for his adopted country and ruled with all the warmth of an expired passport. 16. George I. George. I didn't bother pretending to like England. He ruled it like a man forced into a bad Airbnb rental, unfamiliar, inconvenient, and full of people he didn't trust. Brought over from Hanover to take the throne in 1714, he arrived with a thick accent, a colder attitude, and a complete unwillingness to play the charming monarch. His English was so limited, his speeches had to be phonetically written. But it wasn't just the language barrier, it was the vibe. George had no interest in connecting with the British people, or the British nobility, or, frankly, anyone outside of his tight Hanoverian bubble. His idea of diplomacy was avoiding conversation altogether. He traveled with German staff, threw German parties, and made no effort to adopt English customs, earning him a reputation as aloof, uncaring, and weirdly proud of being unlikable. Courtiers described him as curt, humorless, and visibly irritated by social niceties. When forced to attend public ceremonies, he looked like a man trapped in a nightmare made of powdered wigs and awkward small talk. He kept his mistresses close and everyone else at arm's length. Even his own son despised him. More on that soon. But first, meet the royal who inherited his father's title, his temper, and his complete inability to be pleasant for more than 5 minutes. 17. George II. George II inherited the crown and all the emotional stiffness of his father, George I. If the first Hanoverian king was cold and indifferent, George II was sharp, snappy, and thoroughly unpleasant in ways that felt almost intentional. He wasn't just bad at charm, he seemed actively allergic to it. This was a man who could turn a greeting into an insult and a state function into a personal grievance. He was famously quick-tempered and openly hostile to anyone he considered incompetent, which included most people in a room. His shouting matches with ministers were legendary. He once stormed out of a meeting with his government mid-sentence. When asked why, he replied, "Because they bored me." But his worst relationship was saved for his own son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, whom he loathed with such enthusiasm it became court sport. He mocked Frederick's ideas, blocked his income, and went years without speaking to him. When Frederick died unexpectedly, George II's reported response was, "It's good to be rid of that scoundrel." A grieving father, he was not. He wasn't wildly scandalous or dangerously cruel, just relentlessly irritable, classically petty, and gifted at alienating nearly everyone around him. And as for that son he despised, well, turns out Frederick took after his father just enough to make him completely intolerable in his own right, only with even less subtlety. 18. Prince Frederick, Duke of York. If arrogance was genetic, Prince Frederick, Duke of York, was proof it could be inherited with interest. As the second son of George III and heir presumptive for most of his life, Frederick managed to climb the ranks of power with the kind of entitled ease that required no charm, only lineage, and perhaps a complete disregard for humility. He was handed a top-ranking military position with no experience, promptly failed at it, and still strutted through court as if he'd personally conquered Napoleon. Officers under his command described him as aloof and haughty, with a talent for blaming everyone else when things went sideways, which they often did. Frederick enjoyed pomp, ceremony, and the sound of his own authority. He had no patience for dissent, no tolerance for correction, and was known for talking down to people regardless of their rank. His tone was clipped, his manners forced, and his capacity for self-reflection roughly zero. He wasn't flamboyantly cruel or violently unstable, just deeply convinced of his own importance, and more than willing to use that belief to steamroll anyone in his way. He didn't earn power. He wore it like a robe, unearned, inherited, and always 2 sizes too big. And yet the next royal on our list had something even Frederick lacked: a dangerous sense of righteousness and a divine mandate to back it up. 19. King James II, 7th of Scotland. King James II didn't just believe he was right, he believed you were morally wrong for thinking otherwise. He had the self-righteous intensity of a man convinced that opposition wasn't just inconvenient, it was sinful. His reign wasn't marked by chaos or charm, it was marked by bulldozing. And in true bulldozer fashion, he flattened everyone in his path with blunt force and no reverse gear. Blunt to the point of belligerence, James had no patience for political games or subtlety. Advisors were frequently browbeaten into silence. Courtiers learned to nod, smile, and agree, even when he was wrong, which was often, loudly, and with conviction. Diplomacy was a formality he barely tolerated. If you disagreed with him, he saw it as betrayal. If you tried to mediate, he saw you as weak. His religious views, famously Catholic in a Protestant kingdom, weren't just beliefs. They were crusades. He stacked his court with loyalists, alienated Parliament, and treated criticism as proof of persecution. When people pushed back, he pushed harder. When they begged for compromise, he dug in deeper. It wasn't just stubbornness. It was theological entitlement wrapped in royal robes. He believed God was on his side. Unfortunately for him, so did his enemies. But arrogance doesn't always come wrapped in fury. Sometimes it strolls in wearing silk gloves and a smirk. Enter the royal who made being snobbish look like a full-time performance. 20. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, Eddie. Prince Albert Victor, nicknamed Eddie by his family, looked the part of a charming royal, handsome, well-dressed, always ready for a formal portrait. But behind the carefully maintained exterior was a man so insufferably aloof that even his handlers had trouble pretending he cared. Eddie wasn't cruel in a theatrical way. He was simply disengaged, disinterested, and convinced that his status exempted him from basic interaction. His teachers described him as slow to learn, but quick to adopt airs of superiority. He talked down to almost everyone, especially people without titles, and reportedly struggled to form a sentence that didn't sound like a condescending dismissal. He had a habit of drifting off mid-conversation, often mid-sentence. Staff learned to keep their updates brief, flattering, and never too factual, lest they provoke a blank stare or, worse, a sigh. Eddie's speeches, when he gave them, were memorized phonetically and delivered with the passion of someone ordering wallpaper. His snobbery wasn't earned, it was inherited and worn like a badge. Even Queen Victoria was concerned about his suitability. Not because he was reckless, but because he simply seemed uninterested in everything, especially people. And if you think that's cold, wait until you meet a royal who turned emotional unavailability into a public persona and never once apologized for the ice. 21. Princess Anne, modern. Princess Anne is what happens when blunt force becomes a personality trait. Admired by some for her no-nonsense work ethic, she's equally legendary for her ability to make even polite conversation feel like a disciplinary hearing. Royal watchers call her efficient. Staff just call her scary. She's the kind of royal who can enter a room and cause 3 assistants to instinctively straighten their spines without a word. Not because she's threatening, because she's disappointed. Always. Quietly. Aggressively. Endlessly. Her dry tone and deadpan delivery could make a Christmas card feel like a subpoena. Anne is infamously prickly with the press, allergic to flattery, and well known for cutting comments that land with surgical precision. At public events, she rarely smiles. At private dinners, she allegedly prefers silence to small talk. And if she does engage, it's often with a sharp critique of whatever poor soul wandered into conversational range. She once corrected a reporter mid-question and then answered with, "Next time, prepare better." Her approval is rare, her forgiveness practically non-existent. And while she's not one for theatrics, the cold shoulder from Princess Anne is a cultural event. But even Anne's steel-edged bluntness seems almost gentle compared to the next royal, who didn't just manage the family's legacy, she tried to edit it, one sibling, servant, and diary page at a time. 22. Princess Beatrice, daughter of Queen Victoria. If control were a sport, Princess Beatrice would have taken gold. As Queen Victoria's youngest and most fiercely loyal child, she wasn't just a royal daughter. She was the self-appointed guardian of her mother's memory, her household, and, occasionally, everyone else's emotional oxygen. Beatrice was famously domineering, especially toward her siblings. She policed letters, monitored conversations, and dictated who could see the queen and when. To her, family wasn't about love, it was about order. And she enforced that order with a smile as brittle as porcelain. Her real legacy, though, is literary censorship. After Queen Victoria's death, Beatrice took it upon herself to edit her mother's journals, 40 years' worth of personal writings, and painstakingly rewrote them in her own handwriting, cutting out anything she deemed unfit, which was a lot. Historians still groan. Within the household, she was sharp-tempered and quick to judge. Servants reported a tense atmosphere whenever she was near, with expectations so rigid that even dust motes were likely afraid of her glare. Her sense of duty eclipsed her sense of humor, if she ever had one. Beatrice didn't just live in her mother's shadow, she curated it, redacted it, and enforced it like a one-woman censorship board. And while she kept control through cold precision, the next royal wielded control with brute force, a terrifying stare, and a talent for making staff fear early retirement. 23. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, later King of Hanover. Some royals are distant. Some are difficult. Prince Ernest Augustus? He was terrifying. The 5th son of King George III, Ernest Augustus developed a reputation so severe, so thoroughly toxic, that even the notoriously dysfunctional Hanoverian family seemed to inch away from him. Cold, aggressive, and deeply disliked, he had the kind of presence that could empty a room or start a panic, depending on who you asked. Court officials referred to him as domineering. Servants preferred unbearable. Gossip about him was so plentiful that it stopped being whisper-level scandal and just became routine hallway dread. His political views were authoritarian, his tone with staff was brutal, and his social manners ranged from frosty to outright hostile. It wasn't just that he was rude, it was that he seemed to enjoy making people uncomfortable. There was an ever-present edge to his demeanor, like he was perpetually annoyed by the existence of anyone not named Ernest Augustus. When he became King of Hanover, he ruled it like a fortress, aggressively rolling back liberal reforms and essentially banning freedom of the press, because public opinion was only valid if it flattered him. Spoiler, it didn't. Still, if Ernest's cruelty was systemic and suppressive, the next royal's harshness was messier, emotional, volatile, and wrapped in drama that made even betrayal look theatrical. 24. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, was elegance incarnate, until she wasn't. Regal, radiant, and charismatic, she could charm a room with a glance and alienate a kingdom with a single decision. Her court was a glittering carousel of nobles, artists, rivals, and whisper campaigns, and at the center of it all stood Mary, poetic, proud, and absolutely unpredictable. Her cruelty wasn't planned, it was impulsive. She had a flair for the dramatic, the romantic, and the catastrophically ill-advised. Her marriages alone are a syllabus in bad decisions. But behind every mistake was a woman deeply convinced of her own grandeur. When she was praised, she floated. When criticized, she lashed out, harshly, publicly, and with little concern for collateral damage. She once dismissed a trusted advisor after he questioned one of her many disastrous relationship choices. Because loyalty, in Mary's mind, meant full emotional obedience. Her mood swings were so legendary that staff reportedly rehearsed how to deliver bad news just in case she turned on them mid-sentence. Even her closest allies described her as difficult to reach, impossible to advise, and occasionally frightening in her fury. She was beloved, yes, but never easy, and those who dared to cross her often found themselves cast out, cut down, or conveniently forgotten. But the next royal? She didn't do forgetfulness, she did vengeance. Regal, calculated, and deeply resented. 25. Queen Isabella of Angoulême, consort of King John. If medieval queens were expected to be demure, pious, and politically passive, Queen Isabella of Angoulême missed the memo, and then burned it out of spite. As the consort of King John, yes, that King John, she matched his infamous reputation blow for blow, with her own arsenal of pride, ambition, and weaponized arrogance. Contemporaries described Isabella as beautiful, cunning, and profoundly unlikable. Even in an era where royal marriages were transactional, she managed to alienate allies and enemies alike. Noblewomen whispered of her manipulative tendencies. Courtiers dreaded her sharp tongue. She had a flair for holding grudges and a talent for turning court life into a chessboard. Only she played by her own rules and flipped the board when things didn't go her way. She wasn't just proud, she was spiteful. When she remarried after King John's death, her new political ambitions sent shockwaves through Europe, sparking scandals and diplomatic chaos. Her enemies didn't multiply, they bloomed. And her stepchildren? She didn't bother pretending to like them. Even chroniclers who softened the reputations of kings had little patience for her, describing Isabella as haughty, scheming, and venomously ambitious. But while Isabella's ire came wrapped in silk and smirks, the next royal exuded a different kind of danger, quieter, colder, and cloaked in the shadow of a throne that was never quite safe. 26. Richard III. Richard III didn't need to yell. He didn't even need to threaten. He simply was unsettling. Silent where others raged, still where others flailed. His mere presence was enough to unsettle allies and enemies alike, like a winter wind slipping through a door left slightly ajar. Much of what we know about Richard comes through layers of Tudor propaganda, yes, but even stripped of the worst exaggerations, the portrait that remains is not exactly endearing. Contemporaries spoke of his sarcasm, his unyielding nature, and the sense that every conversation with him was some kind of test you didn't realize you were failing until it was too late. He lacked the warmth and showmanship of his royal peers. No theatrical speeches, no unnecessary charm, just calculation, precision, and the sort of dry contempt that made lesser men wilt. His court was orderly, but not joyful. His advisors were loyal, but nervously so. He inspired fear the way a quiet storm does, by making you wait for the thunder. Even Shakespeare, who painted him as a literal villain, couldn't ignore his unnerving charisma. Richard wasn't flamboyant, he was sharp, and he carried himself like a man who never forgot a slight, never forgave a betrayal, and never let anyone get too comfortable. Next comes a queen who shared that coldness, but turned it inward, turning her court into a shrine of grief and grudges. 27. Princess Mary, Bloody Mary. History knows her by a nickname soaked in fear, Bloody Mary. But even outside the executions and her infamous religious crackdowns, Princess Mary had a personality best described as unwelcoming at best and emotionally scorched earth at worst. Mary Tudor grew up isolated, displaced, and routinely humiliated by her father, Henry VIII. And while her political reign is often discussed in terms of ideology and bloodshed, her personal demeanor was no less icy. Even those sympathetic to her religious goals found her stiff, humorless, and utterly unforgiving. She wasn't one to charm a room. She walked in, and the room went quiet. She had the social grace of a tax audit. Privately, she could be warm to a chosen few, but her broader court described her as rigid, relentlessly moralistic, and utterly incapable of seeing past a slight. Emotional generosity was not on offer. Staff reported her as withdrawn, sharp with instructions, and impossible to please. Unlike her sister Elizabeth, Mary didn't play courtly games or dance around words. She expected obedience, and when she didn't get it, she rarely gave second chances. Her reign may be remembered for fire, but her reputation among those who served her was one of frost. And if Mary left you emotionally bruised, the next royal would leave you seething, because this one had all the ego of a king and none of the responsibility. 28. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. Edward VIII, later known as the Duke of Windsor, had charm. That was never in question. What he didn't have, or seemed to care about, was humility, or tact, or any real regard for the people he was born to rule. He liked being adored. He did not like doing the work that typically earns adoration. From the moment he stepped into the spotlight as Prince of Wales, Edward carried himself like royalty was a lifestyle brand rather than a duty. He disliked official duties, despised paperwork, and made no secret of his contempt for common people. Diplomats found him condescending. Staff found him exhausting. He once dismissed a decades-long royal employee because he found his uniform annoying. Edward believed rules were optional. Tradition, old hat, constitutional obligation, that could wait until after golf. And when faced with a decision that would impact an entire empire, abdicate or end his relationship with Wallis Simpson, he chose romance, yes, but not before dragging the monarchy through a media storm and leaving behind scorched relationships and bitter officials. Even in exile, he didn't soften. He remained snobbish, critical, and deeply uninterested in reflection. For a man who was once the most admired figure in the British Empire, he never seemed to admire much back. And speaking of admirers turned enemies, our next royal was not officially crowned, but she made sure every social circle in London knew when she'd entered the room. 29. Lady Caroline Lamb, connected to the royal circle. Lady Caroline Lamb didn't need a crown to dominate a ballroom, just a glance, a scandal, and a well-timed insult. Born into aristocracy and married into the orbit of the royals, Caroline was the kind of social tornado who left admiration and devastation in equal measure. And if you didn't love her, well, you were probably already on her list. She's mostly remembered for her famously chaotic affair with Lord Byron, who himself described her as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, but that barely scratches the surface. Caroline was sharp-tongued, unapologetically theatrical, and often just plain rude. She once showed up to a party in a costume that was a literal caricature of her ex, just to humiliate him in front of high society. Subtlety was not in her vocabulary. She disrupted royal dinners, insulted dukes, and left duchesses in tears. Courtiers dreaded her presence, not because she was dangerous, but because she was unpredictable and alarmingly honest. Her temper was short, her memory long, and her tolerance for idiocy non-existent. Some saw her as tragic, others as a social menace, but everyone agreed she had a tongue like a scalpel and a knack for turning polite conversation into a public trial. And just when you think you've met the most insufferable royal adjacent, Along comes the final entry, a man whose public image is now less misunderstood prince and more cautionary tale with diplomatic immunity. 30. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Prince Andrew has always walked into a room like it owes him something: attention, applause, and maybe a foot massage. As the second son of Queen Elizabeth II, he grew up in luxury, wielded influence without accountability, and developed a reputation for entitlement that would make a Tudor blush. Long before his current infamy, Andrew was already known behind palace walls as rude, demanding, and casually condescending. Former staff described him as the royal least likely to say please, most likely to throw a tantrum over minor inconveniences, and seemingly allergic to the idea of gratitude. Diplomats dreaded his overseas visits, not because of what he'd say publicly, but because of how he treated the people behind the scenes. He reportedly barked orders, snapped at assistants, and routinely talked down to anyone without a title or a military rank: flight crews, hotel staff, aides, charity workers. No one escaped his legendary lack of decorum. Where his siblings adapted to the growing demands of a modern monarchy, Andrew doubled down on 1980s aristocratic swagger. And then there's the tone-deaf interviews, the disastrous media appearances, and the lingering belief that he still doesn't understand why people are upset. History may be kinder in the long view, but inside palace corridors, his reputation is already set in stone. Arrogant, out of touch, and always the last to realize the room has gone quiet.